Welcome to the Untold Civil War podcast, and we're doing something a little bit different for our YouTube viewers. We're actually doing a Civil War whiskey tasting. With me, I have a good friend of mine, Brian, who was with me at St. John's University. We both got our history degrees here. Thank you for coming on the podcast and the YouTube channel now, and thank you for tasting these whiskeys with me.
No, absolutely. I really appreciate being here, and it's an honor to be here on this podcast.
Awesome. First, we actually have Old Crow. It's even said that General Grant and Mark Twain were fans of this brand. And there's even a story about General Grant. You know, a lot of the guys who didn't like him or who were jealous of him used to say that he was drunk at the Battle of Shiloh, and that's the reason why he took so many casualties. And when they brought this up to Lincoln, Lincoln said, look, I cannot spare this man. He fights. And also, find out what whiskey he drinks and get a barrel of it to all my other generals.
The whiskey that won the Civil War.
Yes, this is the whiskey that won the Civil War. Exactly.
Nice.
So, would you like to give it a shot?
Absolutely.
Let's do it.
True vintage original.
So, Old Crow.
Right, to Old Crow. Here we go.
Well, that's got some kick to it.
It's got a really nice taste.
Oh, yeah.
It's so smooth. You would think like maybe an alcohol or a brand that old might, have a different type of maybe flavor, but it's got a really smooth taste. It just kind of settles down in your mouth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like, really calmly. It doesn't really have any of that burning aftertaste. Sometimes you feel it's a little sweet, but like not too sweet or sugary.
Right.
But you definitely feel some of that sweetness into it. And I love it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, it's great. I mean, without a doubt, this is a Kentucky bourbon.
Absolutely.
Like, this is what I would expect from drinking a Kentucky bourbon.
Yeah.
Just thinking about the stories about, like, Civil War soldiers and, imagining them drinking something like this during the Civil War, they used to do all sorts, the soldiers back then used to do all sorts of shenanigans trying to smuggle whiskey into their camps, which they weren't allowed,
Right.
depending. And so some of them actually would pour the whiskey, or so it said, into the barrels of their muskets when they came into camp. And, I mean, that kind of gives you a whole different idea on whiskey barrels.
Right, and the type of aging.
And the type of aging, right? So that's pretty interesting.
But I think for a lot of the soldiers, dealing with the conditions that they were,
Right,
it would have been a great refreshment.
Oh, yeah.
After a battle.
Definitely
Or just
something.
during downtime.
Yeah, and that reminds me of also whiskey as a motivator. I mean, during the Civil War, if we think about the Battle of Antietam, about the Irishmen who charged over the bridge, Burnside's bridge. They were told to take this bridge and advance on the Confederates. But just a few weeks ago, their whiskey ration was taken from them. So when the commander told them, hey, I need you guys to take this bridge, I think one of the soldiers yelled, we'll take it, but will you give us back our whiskey? And he said, yes, just take the damn bridge. And they did, and I guess they got back their whiskey. So that's
Right.
kind of like interesting, that motivator that some of these guys, you want your whiskey.
Right. I mean, just like looking back at as you probably already talked about in your show, just the idea of logistics and food. You got to keep your soldiers happy.
Yep.
With
Yep.
just even the smallest little
And
niceties at home,
Yeah.
and whiskey would definitely.
Right, exactly. If it's just a warm meal out in the field, or a little shot of whiskey can go a long way.
Absolutely.
A long time, yeah. All right, so now the next whiskey we'll be tasting, or bourbon we're going to be tasting, is Rebel Yell.
Oh, okay.
This is kind of interesting. Of course, we remember Rebel Yell as the Confederate battle cry during the Civil War.
Right.
Striking fear in the northern invader.
Mm-hmm.
Let me play that for you, and let me hear what you think.
1, 2, 3. Charge 'em, boys, charge 'em.
All right, so what did you think of that Rebel Yell?
Hundreds, tens of thousands of young men, all in uniform, all charging at you or shooting at you, and then coming in with this yell. Like, you could have only imagined it even back then, but even in this context, it's still pretty impressive.
absolutely.
considering
Yeah, that's
context.
one of probably the scariest things you could probably hear
Right.
as a young soldier. Imagine you're standing sentry duty, you don't know what's going on, and suddenly you just hear this shrill coming at you from the woods.
Let's see if this whiskey lives up to that death.
Oh, absolutely.
Shriek.
Let's do that. Let's see if it strikes fear into us, right?
Oh,
Cheers.
cheers to Rebel Yell. It has kind of like this dark, smoky sweetness to it. I think.
Definitely, yes.
Dark,
yeah, it's
smoky
definitely
sweetness.
much more dark and smoky than
Right.
what we had before. From what I've read, and I'm sure there's other people watching this who might know more, but from what I've read, this was originally designed or marketed to be sold totally to only southern states.
Oh, that's interesting.
And it was going to be a southern brand.
Mm.
On the original label, they actually had a Confederate cavalryman on there. That has changed. Obviously, we don't have a Confederate cavalryman on the label. But we may be drinking from the last Rebel Yell bottle.
Oh, and how so?
So, I was looking up online just today, trying to find out more about Rebel Yell. And their website has, I think, changed to just Rebel Kentucky Bourbon.
Oh.
So,
okay.
sort of understanding Civil War memory, Rebel Yell, you know, they've taken out, I think they're stepping away from that connection to the Confederacy. They're going for more of just like being a rebel and what it is to like fight the system and, you know, just be a biker rebel type guy. At least that's what I saw on the website. So I don't know, maybe this bottle's gonna be worth something now because they're not selling bottles with Rebel Yell on it.
Right. I mean, that's interesting because, you know, that's an interesting transformation in time from like a whiskey made and produced by and, you know, in a way sold exclusively really to like that type of base,
Right.
that type of market, very much very regional,
Right.
you know, clearly, you know, selling a product to people who would understand that area's past and the
Right.
connotations.
The whole Southern heritage. type
Exactly.
thing, yeah.
And then, you know, but now it's moving, it's obviously branching out.
Right.
It wants to have a more of a national connotation
Right.
and not much of a regional connotation.
Right. All right. Now we're back with our last and final whiskey. Real shame we're coming to a close because I'm having a lot of fun with this episode. But now we're going to look at the Fighting 69th Irish whiskey. Some of our listeners might already know, but that is my alma mater.
Right.
I was an infantryman in the Fighting 69th. This whiskey actually supports the regiment. So every bottle you buy of Fighting 69th, I'll put a link in the description. Every bottle you buy, a portion of it goes to support the 69th Historical Trust, which is connected to the active regiment in the Army National Guard. And they do a great job of preserving the artifacts and really encouraging that esprit de corps in the regiment.
Whoever said you can drink and do some good stuff as well?
Absolutely, yeah. There's good things to be had when drinking this whiskey. I gotta say, of all the bottles sitting before us, this is the most beautiful bottle.
It is.
I think this is a really elegant design. There's all a bunch of Fighting 69th symbolism in here. I did an episode with Colonel Tierney of the Historical Trust, Colonel McGovern from the Historical Trust, Chris Leskowitz, who was the master blender of the Fighting 69th whiskey, and Scott Reed, who's head of marketing for this brand. I got to sit with them and do a whiskey tasting with them involving this whiskey and really get the behind the scenes of this whiskey and also share some untold stories about the 69th New York and the Civil War. So if you want to hear that full interview, go over to the podcast and you can listen to it in audio format. So that's really cool. And that was really fun to do. And I really thank the Fighting 69th whiskey team for coming on the podcast and doing that. When I talked to Chris Leskowitz about this, again, if you want to get more details, go to the podcast. But in a nutshell, it's a blended whiskey, but he understands that the 69th is Irish American.
Right.
So when you drink this, one, you should be able to taste the American bourbon influence, but you should also taste the Irish whiskey
Right.
It's a nice blend. If you want to make a cocktail out of this, go ahead and make a cocktail out of this. In fact, in the podcast episode, we give you a recommendation for an Irish Manhattan, Fighting 69th Irish Manhattan. But you can make any sort of cocktail with this. It's designed that you can drink it neat, you can drink it on the rocks, you can drink it in a cocktail. So it's a very diverse brand. But I think we should just give it a shot. We drink this, toast to the regiment. It's tradition. So.
Of course.
To the
Cheers
regiment.
To the regiment. It's so smooth.
Yeah.
It's so, light.
Yep.
That you can easily see this. You can easily have it, I don't want to say it like that, but kind of like a light drink with a meal, or it can be easily mixed with a series of, other ingredients to make a good cocktail. And I can see it. I can really see how it's really just a great all around, master of all.
Oh, right? Yeah. I'm really drinking that. It really is one of those. It's one of those that I can sit there and have one, and then have another, and have another. Because it's a drinking whiskey. And you can just drink it and enjoy it.
It really goes back to its roots as kind of like a working class
kind
of like whiskey.
Right.
It's coming from like Irish immigrants, newly arrived, going into this regiment, and in many ways, in this case, really proving that they really want to be part of America.
Yes.
Blending both traditions.
Absolutely.
And, it just really kind of just goes with everything and everyone.
Yeah.
And I guess maybe that's the most American thing about it, right? It just kind of melts into wherever you want it to go.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I do think, and one thing I failed to mention, but Chris Leskowitz said this about when he was blending this as a master blender, he could have blended so many top tier whiskey. He could have made it so that it had some outrageous price point.
Right.
And it would have been a great whiskey, and I'm sure people would have bought it. But that's not the mission of the whiskey. The mission was I want to give a whiskey for the average guy to enjoy, and especially the average troop, the average soldier, Private Joe Snuffy, as we say, from the 69th New York, can drink that and enjoy that and have access to. So really, what this all comes down to is we don't have to rate these. We're not up here saying, hey, we're experts at whiskey. Listen, we're two guys that enjoy whiskeys. For you, which one was your favorite, at least?
Really give it to Old Crow.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, the, so to speak, OG of the three.
Yeah.
And I will say the reason I really kind of gave it to Old Crow was that I think it blended kind of it was sweet, but it also had kind of a slight punch.
For me, maybe it's my bias talking. I do think the 69th kind of sealed the deal for me.
Oh, okay.
I think it was just, compared to the other ones, I just think it was just so much smoother. And because it was so smooth, that's just my preference. I like a whiskey that is smooth, that I can sit down and drink it.
Right.
And enjoy it. And I think that one was the most pleasure. I got the most pleasure out of drinking. So there you have it, guys. Thank you so much. If you really like what we're doing here and you want to see more of this type of thing, I'm already in the talks with Matt Callery of Addressing Gettysburg. We're talking about doing a wine tasting, Civil War wine tasting, or a Civil War beer tasting up there in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Ryan, I hope you come through.
No, absolutely. No, perfect. Thank you for inviting me.
Really thanks for coming through. Again, just putting it out there, we don't receive anything from any of these brands.
No.
Okay, we're not receiving anything from any of these brands. These are just Civil War themed whiskeys that we wanted to bring on the show. But if you want to support this show specifically, grocery delivered by Instacart. If you use our link, it'll support the show. And of course, you can download the Gettysburg, A Nation Divided app. Use the code Untold Civil War, and no spaces. And some of the proceeds of all these different links will go to support this show. So thank you very much for tuning in. Please subscribe, hit the like button, hit the bell icon. What do they say? Follow us on Instagram, like us on Facebook, listen to the podcast, and thank you so much, guys.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for being